Shabbat shalom to everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
The topic for this morning's sermon, I know, is going to be a little controversial, because the murder of retired French physician Sarah Halimi alayha shalom shocked and horrified the world, not just once but twice. The caveat that I want to make before I begin the sermon is that I am not questioning or judging the horrific and barbaric act that was committed, i.e. her murder. The first time that we were horrified by this occurrence was in 2017, when the 65-year-old mother of three was brutally beaten and thrown from the window of her Paris apartment. It's unclear whether she was dead before she was thrown from the window, but she was definitely dead after she hit the ground. The Jewish world was stunned when the prosecutor in Paris said that he couldn't say for sure if it was an anti-Semitic act, despite the fact that the murderer, a Muslim immigrant from Mali, shouted, Allah Akbar, I have killed the shaitan, or the demon, as he killed her. It was also shocking that her life could have been saved if the police hadn't gone initially to the wrong address and then hadn't waited for the arrival of a SWAT team. And eventually, the investigator in charge admitted that the crime was anti-Semitic. But in 2019, a judge ruled that the murderer was likely not criminally responsible because of his heavy cannabis use, which put him into a temporary state of psychosis. That was bad. Very bad. But what really shocked and horrified the Jewish world a second time was just last week, when the French Final Court of Appeal upheld the ruling that the killer was temporarily insane from the drug use and therefore was not to stand trial. The ruling triggered outrage in the French Jewish community, in the international Jewish community, and thousands took to the streets to protest that justice was not done. Because I was asked when this happened why I didn't speak on it sooner. And the reason being is that I wanted to do some research first, because I was not convinced before making a statement whether or not the judge was correct or not. And I wanted to do some research into Jewish law and see what Jewish law had to say about this. Israel's chief rabbi David Lau wrote a letter to the Halimi family saying that he was outraged by the decision of the court. And he quoted a passage from the book of Ecclesiastes. He writes, I saw under the sun in the place of justice that wickedness was there. Rabbi Lau also wrote, I am convinced that he who dwells on high sees the abominable injustice. But was there an injustice done by the judge. Because that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the act of what happened. That we know was a terrible and barbaric act. And he goes on, and he will send forth from heavens to the double pain that you have experienced. The 2 times that Sarah, may God avenge her blood, was murdered. Once by the criminal, and second time by those who acquitted him of his crimes. They did not acquit him of his crimes. That is an untrue statement. The court ruling that the judge handed down, whether we like it or not, was completely in line with French law. So you can shout and scream as much as you want. The judge had to do his job. French President Emmanuel Macron called for the law to be changed. That makes sense. The situation is very similar to what happened in America in 1982, after John Hinckley Jr. attempted to assassinate President Reagan. You probably all remember it. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The public felt Hinckley was being let off the hook, and the ruling sparked huge debates on the insanity defense. And since that time, 36 states throughout the United States have reformed their insanity defense law. And 4 states completely abolished the insanity defense. Courts overturned abolishing the insanity defense entirely, saying it's unconstitutional to not have an insanity defense. Now, I am certainly not an expert on French law. I don't pretend to be. And I'm not going to try to analyze the ruling on the basis of French law. That's not where my interest is. I'm going to try and analyze it on the basis of Jewish law, because that is what we should be doing before we rush to the streets and rush to embassies and consulates to let our anger be known. We need to analyze about Jewish law. Does Jewish law provide for an insanity defense? And would it apply in a situation such as this? Notwithstanding Rabbi Lau's cause for justice, the Jewish tradition clearly has an insanity defense. In fact, the original source for the insanity defense anywhere is found in the Mishnah, dating to the 2nd century. The Byzantine Romans learned it from the Jews, and the Anglo-Saxons learned it from the Romans. The Mishnah in Tractate Chagiga says, and I quote, "All are obligated on the 3 pilgrim festivals to appear in the temple and to sacrifice an offering, except for the deaf, the mute, and the imbecile, and a minor." So, of course, the Talmud goes into this whole discussion on who and what qualifies to be an imbecile. Who is considered an imbecile? And the Talmud responds, one who goes out alone at night, and one who sleeps in a cemetery, and one who rends his garments. It was stated that Rav Huna, one of the Talmudic sages, one who does not have the halachic status of an imbecile until there are all the signs present in him at the same time. And Rabbi Yochanan, another great scholar, said he is considered an imbecile even due to the appearance of one of the signs. Now, nowadays, today, of course, we rely on the testimony of psychiatrists. We don't rely on the testimony of the Talmud. Psychiatrists are the ones to determine whether someone is mentally competent, not on whether someone sleeps in a cemetery, as the Mishnah says. But we get this connection here. Further discussion in the Talmud shows that the imbecile is not only exempt from all of the ritual mitzvot, he is also exempt from the ethical mitzvot. He is not held responsible for his actions. And the Talmud, again in Bava Kama, says that it is bad news to get into a tussle with an imbecile. Because if he injures you, he is not liable. But if you injure him, you are liable. There's an 18th century commentary called the Pri Megadim. It's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, on the Code of Jewish Law. Rabbi Yosef ben Meir Ta'omim said that the shoteh, the imbecile, is not subject to punishments for violations they commit. Not in this world, and indeed not in the world to come. Now you might say, and I think you would be justified in this comment, you might say that it's one thing to say that someone has a permanent or at least a very long-lasting mental condition such as schizophrenia, and therefore they should be exempt from punishment. But what about temporary insanity? The Talmud addresses this question as well. Although the context is not the same, but we see where the Talmud is coming from with this. What does the Talmud say? The Talmud says, in the context, it's given of a divorce. Now, divorce, of course, is not a capital crime. The Talmud teaches that if someone orders a scribe to prepare a get, the bill of divorce for his wife, and then has a period of temporary insanity, and during the period of insanity he retracts his previous statement requesting the get, the Beit Din ignores what he said during his period of temporary insanity and goes ahead and issues the divorce document. But what about if the temporary insanity is caused by drugs or alcohol? Is a person responsible for their actions when they're stoned? Again, our Mishnah from 2,000 years ago has an answer. The Mishnah, further expounded upon by Rambam, by Maimonides, says someone who is drunk and gets married while he's drunk, his marriage holds, even if he's very drunk. But, here's where it gets interesting, if he reaches the level of drunkenness of Lot, you know Lot from the Bible, then his marriage is not valid. So the rabbis say, how drunk was Lot? I mean, you're either drunk or you're not drunk. And the Torah says that in the story of Lot, that he was so drunk that he was seduced by his daughters and did not know it. And when somebody can be so psychotic, temporarily or otherwise, that he has no idea what's going on around him, he's not responsible. The insanity defense assumes there is no point in punishing someone who didn't understand what they were doing at the time of the crime. There's no way to teach this person a lesson or to rehabilitate the person. They didn't know what they were doing. On the other hand, society still has a right to protect itself from deranged people. Hinckley, as you might remember, the man who shot Reagan and ultimately killed James Brady, didn't die right away. It took him a while. From that day on, he couldn't work. And he died just a few years ago. Spent 35 years. So Hinckley spent 35 years in a mental institution before he was ruled no longer a danger to others. And therefore, with a lot of conditions attached, he was released. But what about Halimi's killer? Let's go back to Halimi. It seems scary that someone who smokes 2 joints would go to jail for committing murder, but someone who smokes 10 joints receives a get-out-of-free-jail card. Because that's what happens. That's what happened. What President Macron said when he called for changing the law in France was that France does not judge citizens who are sick. We treat them. But deciding to take drugs and then going crazy should not, in my opinion, take away your criminal responsibility. Now that sounds like a statement to me. I believe that's an approach that Judaism would support as well. Even if the murderer may not be fully responsible for the acts committed while in temporary psychosis for smoking crazy amounts of marijuana, he could be held responsible for smoking so much pot that he didn't know what he was doing. And to be clear, for those who cried foul, for those who cried that he got away with it, the killer didn't simply walk free. He's still in a mental institution in France, and common sense tells us that it should be a very long time before anyone could reasonably judge him not to be a danger to Jews or anybody else. Judaism recognizes justice but not vengeance. Cries that the judge didn't do his job, that forced him out, he resigned because he couldn't take the world outcry. Cries for vengeance are not going to bring back Sarah Halimi from the dead. But Jews in France don't feel safe. What could help is for France to change the law as President Macron has suggested, and for French society to recognize the problem of anti-Semitism in their midst, something which hasn't changed over the decades. I would say even going back as far to the early 1800s. All we have to do is look at in the late 1800s at the Dreyfus Affair. Some of you may be aware of it, some of you may not be aware of it, which of course was the trigger for Herzl to turn Zionism from a religious ideology into a political movement and ultimately the creation of the State of Israel. So, if you are going to be angry, and if you're going to start running to embassies and consulates to pronounce your anger against them for letting this guy off, think twice. Think twice what it is you should be actually asking for. And that is, you should be demanding a change of the law, not the resignation of the judge who was following the law. Shabbat Shalom.